Okay, well, it's the evening of December 7th. I'll probably put this on YouTube after I'm done recording. But we remember December 7th, 1941, as the attack on Pearl Harbor that caused the Americans to enter World War II. It's a well-known event for American history. Well, the Second Seminole War, there's an anniversary on December 7th, and it's one of the first skirmishes of the Second Seminole War. Many people think that Dade's battle was the first shot fired in the Second Seminole War. It was not. December 7th, 3 weeks earlier, there was a skirmish in Alachua County in Wacahoota area, the plantation of Gabriel Priest. And and nobody was surprised about the war breaking out. They had all seen it coming. There was failed negotiations with the Seminoles at Fort King with Indian agent Wiley Thompson in 1834 and then April 1835 that ended disastrously. And then there was some tension between Osceola and Agent Wiley Thompson. Wiley Thompson put Osceola in irons and locked him up in the stockade until he had repented and promised to take his people to the west, uh, which he ended up uh, making Thompson believe that he had. And Osceola then did his revenge, killing Thompson on December 28th, the same afternoon that Major Dade's men lied dead on the battlefield there. So uh, we're going to cover a couple incidents that happened before that. Well, finding out information wasn't easy because it involved the Florida militia. There's not much information there. So, uh, after the Second Seminole War ended, there's a Colonel John Eaton. I think he was with the 3rd Infantry in 1850. He was given with the task to record information on all the battles the American Army had participated on since the creation of the modern Army or the Army after the Constitution, from skirmishes and battles going from 1790 until that present time, so covering 60 years. So he recorded a lot of information on battles in the Second Seminole War, which is unique. And one thing about that is he did that when several of the participants were still alive, some that were still in the Army. And let's look at one of them here. And this just says skirmish near Fort Drayton or skirmish. Yeah, yes. So this a skirmish says a party of 14 Florida citizens in a skirmish with a band of Seminole Indians, Florida, on the 10th of December, 1835. It says the skirmish took place probably not far from Fort Drayton, East Florida, for the particulars not specified. Um, so this skirmish is actually um, you know, skirmish with a band of Seminole Indians. So yeah, we don't have much on this. Um, so we don't have much information on that at all. It doesn't really say anything. Um, it's not far from Fort Drayton. Fort Drayton's about 10 or 12 miles north of there, or no, south of there. I'm sorry. Okay. Okay. You have so you have Fort King, and northwest of there was Fort Drayton, and about 10 miles north of Fort Drayton is Fort Micanopy or Micanopy, and Wacahoota is about 8 miles um, west of Micanopy. So there's a trail going down from Wacahooti to Fort Drayton. Now, another thing is that some reports give the name as Wetumpka, and there's three different Wetumpkas in Florida. And early on, before it was called Fort Drayton or General Clinch's plantation, and General Clinch had more than one plantation too. The area was called Wetumpka, and that makes it confusing because there's also a Wetumpka along the St. Johns River near Palatka. And speaking of that, we'll mention Palatka too in a minute. So I'm going to get copied from the newspapers here. Uh, I have from the Richmond Enquirer, January 5th, 1836, and then I'll also be telling parts of that from the Buffalo Patriot and Commercial Advertiser. Richmond Enquirer, January 5th, 1836. Buffalo Patriot and Commercial Advertiser, January 13th, 1836. A week apart, but um, back then something would be printed in the newspapers and go all around the country. This is about a month after the incident, which is about right. It'd take about 3 weeks for incidents in the Second Seminole War to make the newspapers back then. And communication was kind of cut off at the time. So it was bound to be a little confusing for that. So uh, Eaton's report said December 10th, but I think that's wrong. It must be the day the report was received because it was really December 7th, 1835. So going in this says from the Jacksonville Courier on the 17th incident, Indian hostilities, exclamation, exclamation. From the most authentic reports received, it appears that the Seminoles are carrying on their devastation and murdering the inhabitants of the frontier whenever they have an opportunity to do so with impunity. They seem to be prowling about in parties of 10 to 30 strong in the early part of the disturbances occasioned by a hostile spirit displayed by the Indians. Captain Gabriel Priest removed his family from his plantation at Wacahooti to Hogtown. Of course, Hogtown is Gainesville today, northeast, a place 12 or 15 miles northwest of Wacahooti. Well, it's actually northeast. The paper got it wrong in this part. Where is erected a fort for the protection of the people in the vicinity assembling there. There's several forts in that area organized by the citizens and militia at the time. Okay, let's switch back to the easier to read paper here. On Monday of last week, December 7th, a scouting party of 14 or 15 mounted men proceeded from Hogtown to scour the country and particularly to visit Captain Priest's plantation. About 1 mile from the plantation is a little jungle, or what is called a scrub hammock, through which it was by some of the party suggested it would be unsafe to ride. Well, you know what's going to happen next. Four of the party, however, thinking there was no cause of avoiding the thicket, declared they would go through, while the rest of the party proceeded to go around the suspected place. Guess what happens next? The two foremost of the four, however, when about halfway through the hammock, were fired upon by a party of Indians starting up from their ambush. Both were wounded, one Mr. Falk, Folk, receiving a bullet which, entering the point of his shoulder, passing through his throat, came out near his shoulder. Serious injury there. Mr. Priest, son of Captain Gabriel Priest, formerly for many years a member of the Legislative Council, had his horse shot dead from under him and his arm broken. So his horse was shot and fell onto him or knocked him off. His horse fell upon his gun, so that he, unarmed, fled pursued by the Indians and escaped only by running into a swamp and secreting himself by sinking in the water till he had an opportunity to return to Hogtown. So sneak back later on that night or the next day with a broken arm after spending all night in the swamp. This is December, remember, it's probably pretty cold. Mr. Folk, badly wounded as he was, fled a short distance when he was taken up by one of his companions behind him on a horse and carried off. So that's a real Western rescue right there. His wound is said is probably fatal. Bill, and I don't remember seeing his name anymore during the war, so it might have been. The buildings at Wacahooti had probably the day before been burned, and the settlement laid waste. And so, and 10 days later, or so, or about a week later, whenever it was, we'll go to the next incident here. This is Drayton Island, north of Lake George on the St. Johns River. Lake George on the St. Johns River is about, you know, south of Palatka. It's probably the second largest freshwater lake in Florida. A very large lake on the, I think it's the southwestern corner. You have Silver Glen Springs with a spring run that feeds into the lake. There was a large mound complex there, Aboriginal mounds, spectacular shell mounds, including what they called a ball court. All that was hauled away and destroyed for building road fill in the early 20th century. Silver Glen Springs was also General Clinch's other plantation, and it's a little confusing at the time because it's called Silver Springs at the time. So, in in contrast to the other Silver Springs we know about near Ocala. It says Mr. Palmer and Ferris, who have been contract to furnish the government with a quantity of live oak, have been driven from their work by the Indians. Now, one thing about live oak, Florida was the largest producer of naval stores at this point in history. You need the live oak for building the ships. It's the best kind of wood for building ship timbers. It doesn't rot or deteriorate like pine or some of the other wood. So it's the big cash crop in Florida at the time. Previous live oak was harvested in South Carolina and Georgia, but of course the resource was um, plundered so much that it was diminished. In fact, the USS Constitution, Old Ironsides, her oak timbers um, were harvested from Georgia. Uh, anyway, these gentlemen had about 30 men in their employ cutting live oak on Drayton's Island in the lower part of Lake George. Well, when I say lower, the Swanee River flows south to north. So the upper St. Johns River is actually south, and the lower St. Johns River is north. So it's this lower part of Lake George. I guess that's north part of Lake George. I don't know. Anyway, I should have gotten out a map before I read this and looked at it on a map. Last week on Sunday or Monday at the evening, the men of the island were informed by one of Mr. Kingsley's Negroes left on the island in charge of the improvements there that the Indians intended that night or the next to attack them, plunder, and burn their encampment. Kingsley's plantation, Mr. Zephaniah Kingsley, had more than one plantation as well. He had a plantation down here, south of Palatka. And of course, you can visit his other plantation north of Jacksonville, which is now a national park, Kingsley's Plantation. Receiving this intelligence and having no means of defense, they, in some haste, abandoned the encampment, having provisions, and proceeded by boats to the headquarters of Mr. Palmer and Ferris at Rollstown. Rollstown is north of there on the St. Johns. I think it was opposite Palatka, opposite of Ravine Gardens on the other side of the St. Johns River. Mr. Rolls was a British man who had a land grant from the British and plantation at that point. The name still stuck long after he's left. And I think there was a Seminole War fort there, Fort Hunter, named after Captain Hunter of the 2nd Dragoons. On Thursday of last week, the 10th instant, 6 of the men armed, that being the number of guns they could raise, returned to the island to see what the Indians had done. To their surprise, they found all safe in their encampment as they had left it. The leader of the 6 men detained 2 with him and went 3 with the boat down on Friday to Rollstown for the remainder of the men to return to the island in order to go on with the work. Several returned on Saturday. On Sunday, the men were out rambling over the island. They saw no Indians nor signs of them. At sundown, all were assembled at the encampment. The cook, by mere accident, saw just back of the encampment an Indian skulking in the bushes. The cook hastened in, reported what he had seen. He was hardly credited, yet for certain safety of the men, 16 in number, concluded to put everything on board their 2 boats and again abandon the island. They did so, but on their way they were under the necessity of passing the northern point of the island near the shore. This point on which Mr. Kingsley's plantation, the small boat containing 6 men with 6 guns passed unmolested, but the larger boat containing 10 men unarmed, when opposite, was fired upon by a party of, it is supposed, 6 Indians. From the confusion among the men, 1 or 2 falling overboard, the boat was so long delayed within their reach that a party on shore reloading gave them a second discharge. So gave them enough time that the Indians could reload their muzzle loaders and fire again. After the second discharge, the Indians set up their war whoop and yell, which is said frightened the live oak cutters more than the discharge of the rifles. None were killed. One was slightly wounded, a ball cutting the back of his head without injuring the skull. A ball cut the brim of another's hat. A ball cut through the sleeve of a third man's jacket. To account for the Indians shooting so random, it is supposed that they were to see by the looming of the boat, as it was within about 100 yards of the point, and therefore in the shade of the shore. That sounds a little confusing, but it's kind of easier explained on the next sentence where it said, add to this, it was just dark. So it's dark. They couldn't see well. They overshot, or they would have made the havoc among the men crowded in the boat. Both boats urged their course down the river, and especially the small boat having all the armed. So the boat that's armed beats retreat quicker than the boat that's unarmed. Soon as they saw the flames of the buildings on the island, and the whoop seemed to have been the signal to communicate the fire to the improvements destined to destruction. The Negroes had some days before left the island. Doubtless everything like a habitation is destroyed, so the woodcutters left. So there you have 2 incidents before Dade's battle, I think 10 days apart. Attack on Gabriel Priest's plantation on December 7th. And then you have the attack of the woodcutters on Drayton Island. I think that was on December 17th. And the next skirmish would be a big one, what they call the Battle of Black Point, but that deserves its own video and reading a story. But I thought you might find that interesting as some skirmishes already happening before Dade's battle. And at the same time, Kawakachi, or Chief Wildcat, and his father, King Phillips, were starting to burn all the sugar plantations on the East Coast south of St. Augustine. So quite a bit of action going on before December 28th. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and that's it for now.